afternoon, students. Today we are going to start reading Old Yeller by Fred Gibson. While we read this book, I want you guys to think about some questions and see how you feel about them at the beginning and how you feel about them at the end. If your opinion's changed, if it's stayed the same. So these essential questions are, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to grow up? And are these the same thing? As we go through, like I said, just think about these, and we'll talk more about it later on. So this book is a narrative, which, if you remember, a narrative has a rising action, setting, has a plot, it has a climax. I want you to think about these things as we go through the book, about the different descriptions of a narrative. This book is set in the 1860s, so I want you to think about what do you think life was like in the 1860s? How is it different from life now? Are there some similarities? Do you think people talked differently back then? Now, thumbs up or thumbs down, who remembers what colloquial language is? Thumbs up? Okay. What do you think might have been difficult about living in the 1860s? Would you prefer living back then? Thumbs up. Or prefer living now? Thumbs down. Okay. So, there are some vocabulary words that we're going to need to go through for this book. But first, I want to talk to you a little bit about how a couple things are portrayed in this book that might be different from now. So, in this book, Native Americans are portrayed in kind of a poor light because this was the point that they had been put on reservations and we had taken the land from them. So they felt the need to fight back. So in the story, Native Americans, like I said, are portrayed in kind of a bad light. But this is how they were viewed back then. So we just have to keep that in mind. And also, hunting is a big deal back then. And I know some of you hunt now and some of you don't. But back then, it was very important to hunt in order to gain food and meat for your family. Okay, so the vocabulary words we're going to talk about, the first one is a knoll. Who knows what a knoll is? No one? It's a hill. It's just a small hill. Okay, our next vocabulary word is frantic. Does anybody know what frantic is? I know, it's hard to put into words. What it means is like wild with fear or anxiety, so you're frantic. So staves. In this book it says he falls into staves. Staves is like a panic attack. Like completely freaking out. Next word is aggravated. Who knows what aggravated is? That's right. Annoyed or frustrated. Thumbs up if you've ever felt aggravated. Thumbs down if you haven't. That's right, I should see everybody's thumbs up. We've all felt aggravated at some point. And the last word is careen. So that means to move in an uncontrolled way. So a car could careen off a cliff. Say your mom is driving and she hits some ice. Her car might careen and it's out of control. Okay, so we are going to look at a quick slideshow just to look and see what things looked like back then. Just to give you an idea, these are pictures from the movie so that you have an idea on what stuff looks like. Okay, so this is kind of the house. These are made of logs that have been stacked together, and it's handmade. This is a quote from the book that I want you guys to think about as we read. What I mean is, things like that happen. They may seem mighty cruel and unfair, but that's how life is a part of the time. But that isn't the only way life is. A part of the time, it's might good, and a man can't afford to waste all the good parts worrying about the bad parts. That makes it all bad. And as you can see, this is kind of an overview of the corrals and the house. It has a walkthrough area in the middle where the two places are joined. That's where they talk about hanging the meat and such. Now we're going to watch a quick video just to kind of get an idea of the lay of the land.
I'm like Yeller, best dog in the West. Old Yeller was a mongrel, an ugly lop-eared mongrel, fancy free without a family tree. But he could up and do it, and prove there's nothing to it, and that's how a good dog should be. Here, Yeller, come back, Yeller. Best doggone dog in the West. Best doggone dog in the West. Old Yeller was a hunter, a rare and tearing hunter. In any chase he knew just how to run. And when he hunted trouble, he always found it double. And that's when old Yeller had fun. Here, Yeller, come back, Yeller. Best doggone dog in the West.
Without further ado, let's get started. Old Yeller by Fred Gibson. Chapter 1. We called him Old Yeller. The name had a sort of double meaning. One part of his name meant that his short hair was dingy yellow, a color that we called yeller in those days. The other meant that when he opened his head, the sound he let out came closer to being a yell than a bark. I remember like yesterday how he strayed in and out of nowhere to our log cabin on Birdsong Creek. He made me so mad at first that I wanted to kill him. Then later, and I had to kill him, it was like having to shoot some of my own folks. That's how much I'd come to think of the big yeller dog. He came in the late 1860s, the best I remember. Anyhow, it was the year that Papa and a bunch of other Salt Lake settlers formed a pool herd of their little separate bunches of steers and trailed them to the new cattle market at Abilene, Kansas. This was to get cash money, a thing that all Texans were short of in those years right after the Civil War. We lived then in a new country, and a good one. As Papa pointed out the day the men talked over making the drive, we had plenty of grass, wood, and water. We had a wild game for killing, fertile ground for growing bedcorn, and the Indians had been put on the reservations with the return of the U.S. soldiers to the Texas forts. In fact, Papa wound up, all we lack having a tight tail hold on the world is a little cash money, and we can get that at Abilene. Well, the idea sounded good, but some of the men still hesitated. Abilene was better than 600 miles north of the Texas hill country we lived in. It would take months for the men to make the drive and ride back home, and all that time the women folks and the children of Salt Lakes would be left in a wild frontier settlement to make out the best they could. Still, they needed money, and they realized whatever a man does, he's bound to take some risks. So they talked it over with each other and with the women and decided it was the thing to do. They told their folks what to do in case Indians came off the reservation, or the coons got to eating the corn, or the bears got to killing too many hogs. Then they gathered their cattle, burned a trail brand on their hip, and pulled out on the long trail to Kansas. I remember how it was the day Papa left. I remember how he was standing in front of the cabin with his horse saddled, his gun in his scabbard, and his bedroll tied on the back of his cantle. I remember how tall and straight and handsome he looked, with his high-crowned hat and his black mustaches drooping in cow-horn curves past the corners of his mouth. And I remember how Mama was trying to keep from crying because he was leaving, and how little Arliss, who was only 5 and didn't know much, wasn't trying to keep from crying at all. In fact, he was howling his head off, not because Papa was leaving, but because he couldn't go too. I wasn't about to cry. I was 14 years old, pretty near a grown man. I stood back and didn't let on for a minute that I wanted to cry. Papa got through loving up Mama and little Arliss and mounted his horse. I looked up at him. He motioned for me to come along, so I walked beside his horse down the trail that led under the big live oaks and past the spring. Then he'd gotten out of hearing of the house. Papa reached down and put a hand on my shoulder. "Now, Travis," he said, "you're getting to be a big boy, and while I'm gone you'll be the man of the family. I want you to act like one. You take care of Mama and little Arliss. You look after the work, and don't wait around for your Mama to point out what needs to be done. Think you can do that?" "Yes, sir," I said. "Now, there's the cows to milk, the wood to cut, and young pigs to mark, and fresh meat to shoot. But mainly there's the corn patch. If you don't work it right, or if you let the varmints eat up the roasting ears, we'll be without bread corn for the winter." "Yes, sir," I said. "All right, boy. I'll be seeing you this fall." I stood there and let him ride on. There wasn't any more to say. Suddenly I remembered and went running down the trail after him, calling for him to wait. He pulled up his horse and twisted it in the saddle. "Yeah, boy?" he said. "What is it?" "The horse," I said. "What horse?" he said, like he'd never heard me mention it before. "You mean you're wanting a horse?" "Now, Papa," I complained, "you know I've been aching all over for a horse to ride. I've told you time and again." I looked up to catch him grinning at me and felt foolish that I hadn't realized he was teasing. "Well, you're needing worse a horse is a good dog." "Yes, sir," I said, "but a horse is what I'm wanting the worst." "All right," he said. "You act the man's part while I'm gone, and I'll see you get a man's horse to ride when I sell the cattle. I think we can shake on that deal." He reached out his hand, we shook. It was the first time I'd ever shaken hands like a man. It made me feel big and solemn and important in a way I've never felt before. I knew then that I could handle whatever needed to be done while Pop was gone. I turned and started back up the trail towards the cabin. I guess maybe Pop was right. I guess I could use a dog. All the other settlers had dogs. They were big, fierce cur dogs that the settlers used for catching hogs and driving cattle and fighting coons out of the cornfield. They kept them as watchdogs against the depredations of loafer wolves, bears, panthers, and raiding Indians. There was no question about it. For the sort of country we lived in, a good dog around the place was sometimes worth more than 2 or 3 men. I knew this as well as anybody, because the summer before I had a good dog. His name was Bell. He was nearly as old as I was. We'd had him ever since I could remember. He protected me from rattlesnakes and bad hogs while I was little. He hunted with me when I was bigger. Once he'd dragged me out of Birdsong Creek when I was about to drown, and another time he'd given me a warning to keep some raiding Comanches from stealing and eating our mule, Jumper. Then he had to go act the fool and get himself killed. It was while Papa and I were cutting wild hay in a little patch of prairie back of the house. A big diamond-head rattler struck at Papa. Papa chopped his head off with one quick lick of his scythe. His head dropped to the ground 3 or 4 feet away from the writhing body. It lay there, with its ugly mouth open and shut and still trying to bite something. As smart as Bell was, you'd have thought he'd have better sense to go up and nuzzle a rattler's head. But he didn't, and a second later he was falling back, howling and slinging his own head till his ears popped. But it was too late then. The snake's mouth had snapped shut on his nose, driving fangs in so deep that it was a full minute before he could sling the bloody head loose. He died that night, and I cried for a week. Papa tried to make me feel better by promising to get me another dog right away, but I wouldn't have it. It made me mad just to think of some other dogs trying to take Bell's place. I still felt the same about it. All I wanted now was a horse. The trail I followed led along the bank of Birdsong Creek, through some myrtle bushes. The bushes were blooming white and smelled sweet. In the top of one a mockingbird was singing. It made me recollect how Birdsong Creek got its name. Mama mentioned it when she and Papa came to settle. Mama told me about it. She said she named it the first day she and Papa got there, with Mama driving the ox cart loaded with our house plunder, with Papa driving the cows and horses. They meant to build closer to the other settlers, over on Salt Branch, but they camped there at the spring, and the bee myrtle had been blooming white that day, and seemed that in every bush there was a mockingbird singing his fool head off. It was all so pretty and smelled so good, and the singing birds made such fine music that Mama wouldn't go on. "We'll build right here," she told Papa. And that's what they done. Built themselves a house right here on Birdsong Creek, and fought off the Indians, and cleared a little corn patch, and raised me and little Arliss, and lost a little sister who died of a fever. That was my home too, and while Papa was gone, it was up to me to look after it. I came to a spring that gushed clear, cold water out of a rock split in the rock ledge. The water pulled into a pothole about the size of a wagon bed. In the pothole, right up to his ears in the water, stood little Arliss, right in our drinking water. I said, "Arliss, you get out of that water." Arliss turned around and stuck his tongue out at me. "I'll cut me a sprout," I warned. All he did was stick his tongue at me again and splash water in my direction. I got my knife out and cut a green mesquite sprout, trimmed all the leaves and thorns off, then headed for him. Arliss thought that I meant business. He came lunging up out of the pool, knocking water all over his clothes lying on the bank. He lit out for the house, running naked and screaming bloody murder. To listen to him, you'd have thought Comanches were lifting a scalp. Okay, thumbs up or thumbs down? Do you think Arliss was acting like a man when he did that, or like a boy? Man or boy? Okay. Mama heard him and came rushing out of the cabin. She saw little Arliss running naked. She saw me following after him with a mesquite sprout in one hand, his clothes in the other. She called out to me. "Travis," she said, "what on earth have you done to your little brother?" I said, "Nothing yet, but if he doesn't keep out of our drinking water, I'm going to wear him to a frazzle." That's what Papa always told little Arliss when he caught him in the pool. I figured if I had to take Papa's place, I might as well talk like him. Mama stared at me for a minute. I thought she was going to fix and argue that I was getting too big for my britches. Lots of times she'd tell me that. This time she didn't. She smiled suddenly and grabbed little Arliss by one ear and held on. He went on hollering and jumping up and down and trying to pull away, but she held on till I got there with his clothes. She put them on him and told him, "Look here, young squirrel, you better listen to your big brother Travis if you want to keep out of trouble." Then she made him go sit still a while in the dog run. Dog Run was an open roof space between the two rooms of our log cabin. It was a good place to eat watermelon in the hot summer or to sleep in the night when the breezes weren't strong enough to push through the cracks between the long cabin logs. Sometimes we hung up fresh-killed meat there to cool out. Little Arliss sat in the dog run and sulked while I packed water from the spring. I packed the water in a bucket that Papa had made out of the hide of a cow's leg. I poured water in the ash hopper and stood beside our cabin. That was so the water could trickle down through the wood ashes and become low water. Later, Mama would fix the low water with hog fat and boil it in the iron pot when she was ready to make soap. When I went to cut wood for Mama, though, little Arliss left the dog run to come watch me work. Like always, he stood exactly in the right place for chips from my axe to fly up, maybe knock his eyeballs out. I said, "You better skin out for the house, you little scamp." He skinned out, too, just like I told him, without ever sticking his tongue out at me this time. He sat right there till Mom called us to dinner. After dinner, I didn't wait for Mom to tell me that I needed to finish up running the corn middles. I got right up from the table, went out and hooked up Jumper the double shovel. I started plowing where Papa left off the day before. I figured that if I got an early start, I could get the corn patch done by sundown. So, do you think Travis acted like a boy or a man? A man or a boy? Man or a boy, right then. Okay. Jumper was a dun mule with a narrow black stripe running along his backbone between his mane and tail. Papa named him Jumper because no one yet had ever built a fence he couldn't jump over. Papa claimed Jumper could clear the moon if he took notion to see the other side of it. Jumper was a pretty good mule, though. He was gentle to ride. You could pack in fresh meat on him, and he was willing to pull a plow. Only sometimes when I plowed him and he decided his quitting time has come, he'd stop work right then. Maybe we'd be out in the middle of the field when Jumper got the notion that it was time to go eat for dinner. Right then he'd swing around and head for the cabin, dragging down corn with the plow and paying no mind to my hauling back on the reins and hollering, "Whoa!" Later that evening, Jumper tried to pull that stunt on me again, but I was laying for him. When Papa gone, I knew I had to teach Jumper a good lesson. I'd been plowing all afternoon, holding a green cedar club between the plow handles. I still lacked 3 or 4 corn rows being finished till when sundown came and Jumper decided it was quitting time. He let out a long bray and started wringing his tail. He left the middle where he was traveling in. He struck out through the young corn and headed for the cabin. I didn't even holler "whoa" at him. I just threw the looped reins off my shoulders and ran up beside him. I drew back my green cedar club and whacked him so hard across the jawbone that I nearly dropped him in his tracks. You ain't never saw a worse surprised mule. He snorted, started to run, then stood there and stared at me, like maybe he couldn't believe I was man enough to club him that hard. Okay, do you think right there Travis was acting like a man or a boy? Man or boy? I drew back my club again. "Jumper," I said, "if you don't get back there and finish this plowing job, you're going to start getting more of the same, you understand?" I guess he understood all right. Anyhow, from then on, we were through. He stayed right on the job. The only thing he did different from what he'd done with Papa was to travel with his head turned sideways, watching me every step of the way. When I finally got to the house, I found that Mama had done the milking, and she and Arliss were waiting for supper on me, just like we generally waited for Papa when he came in late. I crawled into bed with little Arliss that night, feeling pretty satisfied with myself. Our bed was a corn shuck mattress laid over a couple of squared-up cowhides that had been laced together. The cowhide stood 2 feet off the dirt floor, stretched inside a tight pull frame Papa had built in one corner of the room. I lay there and listened to the corn shucks squeak when I breathed, and to the howls hooting in the timbers along Birdsong Creek. I guess I made a good start. I'd done my work without having to be told. I taught little Arliss and Jumper that I wasn't to be trifled with. Mama could already see that I was man enough to wait on supper. I guess that I could handle things while Papa was gone, just about as good as he could. Chapter 2. It was the next morning when the big yeller dog came. I found him at daylight when Mama told me to step out the dog run and cut down a side of middling meat, hanging to the pole rafters. The minute I opened the door and looked up, I saw the meat was gone. It had been tied to the rafters with bare grade glass braided together for string. Now nothing was left of the pole but the frazzled ends of snapped blades. I looked down then. At the same instant, a dog rose from where he'd been curled on the ground beside the barrel that held our cornmeal. It was a big, ugly, slick-haired yellow dog. One short ear had been chewed clear off, and his tail had been bobbed so close to his rump there was hardly any stub left to wag. But the most noticeable thing to me about him was how thin and starved he looked, all but his belly. His belly was swelled up tight and round as a pumpkin. It wasn't hard to tell how come that belly was so full. All I had to do was look at the piece of curled-up rind lying in the dirt next to him with all the meat gnawed off. That side of meat had been a big one, but now there wasn't enough meat left on the rind to interest a pack rat. Well, to lose not only the meat we had from last winter, the hog butchering was bad enough, but what made me even madder was the way the dog acted. He didn't even have the manners to feel ashamed of what he'd done. He rose to his feet, stretched, yawned, and came romping toward me, wiggling his stub tail, yelling, "Yo, yo, yo!" just like he belonged there, and I was his best friend. "Why, you thieving rascal!" I shouted and kicked him as hard as I could. He ducked just in time so that I missed him by a hair, but nobody could have ever told I missed by the way he fell over the ground and lay there with his belly up and his 4 feet in the air, squalling and bellowing at the top of his voice. The racket he made, you'd have thought I'd had a club and breaking every bone in his body. Is Travis acting like a man or a boy here? Man or boy? Okay. Mama came running to stick her head through the door and asked, "What on earth, Travis?" "Why, this old stray dog has come up and eaten our middling meat clear up," I said. I aimed another kick at him. He's quick and rolled out of reach again, just in time, then fell over the ground and lay there yelling louder than ever. Then out came little Arliss. He was naked like he always slept in the summer. He was hollering, "A dog! A dog!" He ran past me and fell on the dog, petting him till he quit howling, then turned on me, fighting mad. "You quit kicking my dog," he yelled fiercely. "You kick my dog and I'll wear you to a frazzle." The batting stick that Mommy used to beat the dirt out of clothes when she washed stood leaning against the wall. Now little Arliss grabbed it up with both hands and came at me swinging. It was such a surprise move, little Arliss making fight at me that way, that I just stood there with my mouth open and let him clout me a good one before I thought to move. Clout means to hit. Then Mama stepped in and took the stick away from him. Arliss turned on her, ready to fight with his bare fist. Then he decided against him, ran and put his arms around the big dog's neck. He began to yell, "He's my dog! You can't kick him! He's my dog!" The big dog was back up on his feet now, wagging his stub tail again and licking the tears off of Arliss's face with his pink tongue. Mama laughed. "Well, Travis," she said, "it looks like we've got us a dog." "But, Mama," I said, "you don't mean that we'd keep an ugly old dog like that? One that'll come in and steal meat right out of the house?" "Well, maybe we can't keep him," Mama said. "Maybe he belongs to someone around here who'll want him back." "He doesn't belong to anyone around in the settlement," I said. "I know every dog in Salt Licks." "Well then," Mama said, "if he's a stray, there's no reason why little Arliss can't claim him. Then you'll have to admit he's a smart dog. Mighty few dogs have sense enough to figure out a way to reach the side of meat hanging it that high. He must have climbed up on top of that meat barrel and jumped over from there." I went over and looked at the wooden lid on top of the meal barrel. Sure enough, the thin film of dust that had settled over it were dog tracks. "Well, all right," I admitted. "He's a smart dog, but I still don't want him." "Now, Travis," Mama said, "you're not being fair. You had a dog when you were little, but little Arliss has never had one. He's too little for you to play with, and he gets lonely." I didn't say any more. When Mama got her mind set a certain way, there was no use in arguing with her. But I didn't want that meat-thieving dog on the place, and I didn't aim to have him. So I might have put up with him for a day or so, but sooner or later I'd find a way to get rid of him. Mama must have guessed what was going on in my mind, for she kept handing me sober looks all the time she was getting breakfast. She fed us cornmeal mush cooked in a pot swung over the fireplace. She sweetened it with wild honey that Papa and I had cut out of a bee tree last fall, and added cream and skimmed off of last night's milk. It was good eating, but I'd had my appetite whetted for fried middling meat to go with it. Mama and I waited till I was done, then said, "Now, Travis, as soon as you milk the cows, I think you ought to get your gun and try to kill us a fat doe for meat. While you're gone, I want you to do some thinking about what I said about little Arliss and the stray dog." Chapter 3. All right, I was willing to make a try for a fat doe. I was generally more than willing to go hunting, and while I was gone I might do some thinking about little Arliss and that thieving stray dog, but I didn't much think my thinking would take the turn the Mama wanted. I went and milked the cows and brought in the milk for Mama's strain. Got my rifle, went out the lot, and caught Jumper. I tied a rope around his neck, half-hitched the noose around his nose, and pitched the rest of the rope down across his back. This was the rope I'd rein him with. Then I got me a second rope and tied it tight around his middle, just back of his withers. The second rope I'd use to tie my deer onto Jumper's back, if I got one. Papa'd show me how to tie a deer's feet together and pack it home across my shoulders, and I'd done it. But to carry a deer that far like that was sweat-poppin' job that I'd rather leave to Jumper. He was bigger and stronger. I mounted Jumper bareback and rode him along Birdsong Creek and across a rocky hogback ridge. I thought how fine it would be if I was riding my own horse instead of an old mule. I rode down the long sweeping slope where a scattered of huge, ragged-topped live oaks stood about in grass so tall that it dragged the underside of Jumper's belly. I rode to within a quarter-mile of the salt licks, then I left Jumper tied to a thicket and went on afoot. I couldn't take Jumper close to the salt licks for a couple of reasons. In the first place, he'd get to swishing his tail and stomp his feet at the flies and maybe scare off my game. On top of that, he was gun-shy. Fire a gun close to Jumper and he'd fall into staves. Remember, staves is a panic attack. He snorted and wheeled to run and fall back against his tie rope, trying to break loose. He'd bawl and paw the air and take on like he'd been shot. When it came to gunfire, Jumper didn't have any more sense than a red ant and a hot skillet. It was a fine morning for hunting, with the air still and the rising sun shining bright on the tall green grass and the greener leaves of the timber. There wasn't enough breeze blowing for me to tell which wind direction, so I licked one finger and held it up. Sure enough, the side next to me cooled first. That meant that what little push there was to the air was away from me, toward the salt licks, which wouldn't do at all. No deer would come to the salt licks if they caught wind of me first. I half-circled the licks till I had the breeze moving across them toward me and took cover under a wild grapevine that hung low out of the top of a gnarled oak. I sat down with my back against the trunk of the tree. I sat with my legs crossed and my rifle cradled on my knees. Then I made myself get as still as the tree. Papa taught me way back when I was little, same as he taught me to hunt downwind for my game. He always said, it's not your shape that catches the deer eye, it's your moving. If a deer can't smell you and can't see you move, he won't ever know you're there. So I sat there, holding as still as a stump, searching the clearing around the licks. The licks were scattering outcroppings of dark rocks with black streaks in them. The black streaks held salt that Papa said had got mixed up in the rocks a jillion years ago. I didn't know how he knew what happened so far back, but the salt was there, and all the hogs and cattle and wild animals in that part of the country came there to lick it. One time, Papa said, when he and Mama had first settled there, they run clean out of salt and had to beat up pieces of rock and boil them in the water. Then they used the salty water to season their meat and cornbread. Wild game generally came to lick the rocks in the early mornings or late evenings. Those were the best times to come for meat. The killer animals like bear and panther and bobcats knew this and came to the licks at the same time. Sometimes we'd get a shot at them. I killed 2 bobcats and a wolf there while waiting for a deer. Once Papa shot a big panther right after it had leapt on a mule colt and broke its neck with one slap of his heavy forepaw. I hoped I'd get to shoot at a bear or panther this morning. The only thing that showed up, however, was a little band of javelina hogs, and I knew better than to shoot them. Make a bad shot and wound one so they went to squealing, and you had the whole bunch after you, ready to eat you alive. They were small animals. Their tushes weren't as long as those of the wild range hogs we had running wild in the woods. Tushes or tusks. They couldn't cut you as deep, but once javelinas got you, they kept after you for a longer time. Once Jed Simpson's boy, Russell, shot into a bunch of javelinas and they took after him. They treed him up a mesquite and kept him up there from early morning till long after supper time. Mesquite was a small one, and they nearly chewed the trunk of it in two trying to get at him. After that, Russell was willing to let the javelinas alone. Javelinas moved away. I saw some bobwhite quail feed in the open around the licks. Then here came 3 cows with young calves in a roan bowl. They stood and licked at the rocks. I watched them a while, then got to watching a couple of squirrels playing under the top of a tree close to the one where I sat. Squirrels were running and jumping and chattering and flashing their tails in sunlight. One would run along the tree branch, then take a flying leap to the next branch. There would sit, fussing and waiting to see if the second one had the nerve to jump that far. Then the second squirrel did. The first one would set up an excited chatter and make for a longer leap. Sure enough, after a while, the leader tried to jump a gap that was too wide. He missed his branch, clawed at some leaves, and came tumbling to the ground. The second squirrel went to dancing up and down on the branch then, chattering louder than ever. It was plain that he was getting a big laugh of how the show-off squirrel had made such a fool of himself. The sight was so funny that I laughed myself, and that's where I made a mistake. Where the doe had come from and where had she gotten so close without me seeing her, I don't know. It was like she suddenly lit down out of the air like a buzzard, or risen up out of the bare ground around the rocks. Anyhow, she stood there staring at me, sniffing and snorting and stomping her forefeet against the ground. She couldn't have scented me, and I hadn't moved, but I laughed out loud at those squirrels, and that sound had warned her. Well, I couldn't lift my gun then with her staring straight at me. She'd see the motion and take a scare, and while Papa was good enough to shoot down a running deer, I never tried it and didn't much think I could. I figured it was smarter to wait. Maybe she'd quit staring at me after a while and give me a chance to lift my gun. But I waited and waited, and she kept looking at me, trying to figure me out. Finally, she started coming towards me. She'd take one dancing step and then another and bob her head and flap her long ears about, then start moving toward me again. I didn't know what to do. It made me nervous the way she kept coming at me. Sooner or later she was bound to make out what I was, then she'd whirl and be gone before I could draw a bead on her. She kept doing me that way till finally my heart was flopping around inside my chest like a catfish in a wet sack. I could feel my muscles tightening up all over. I knew then that I couldn't wait any longer. It was either shoot or bust wide open, so I whipped my gun up to my shoulder. Like I figured, she snorted and wheeled so fast she was a brown blur against my gun sights. I pressed the trigger and hoped my aim was good. After I fired the black powder charge of my gun, threw up such a thick fog of blue smoke that I couldn't see through it. I reloaded, then leapt to my feet and went running through the smoke. What I saw when I came to the clear again made my heart drop down in my shoes. There went the frightened, snorting cattle stampeding through the trees with their tails in the air like it was heel fly time. And right beside 'em went my doe, running all humped up with her white tail clamped tightly to her rump, which meant I'd hit her but hadn't made a killing shot. I didn't like that. I never mind killing for meat. Like Papa told me, every creature has to kill to live. But a wounded animal is something else, especially one pretty and harmless as a deer. It made me sick to think of the goat escaping, maybe to hurt for days before she finally died. I swung my gun up, hoping to get in a killing shot, but I couldn't fire on account of the cattle. They were too close to dealer. I might kill one of them. Then suddenly the doe did a surprising thing. Way down on the flat there, nearly out of sight, she ran head on into the trunk of the tree, like she was stone blind. I saw the flash of her light-colored belly when she went down. I waited. She didn't get back up. I tore out running toward the chin-tall grass as fast as I could. When finally I reached the place all out of breath, I found her lying dead with a bullet hole through her middle, right where it had to have shattered her heart. Suddenly I wasn't sick anymore. I was feeling big and strong and sure of myself. I hadn't made a bad shot. I hadn't caused an animal a lot of suffering. All I'd done was get meat for the family, shooting it on the run, just like Papa did. Is Travis acting like a man here or like a boy? Okay. I rode towards the cabin, sitting behind the gutted deer that I'd tied across Jumper's back. I rode feeling proud of myself as a hunter and provider for my family. Making a killing shot like that one on a moving deer made me feel bigger and more important. Too big and important, I guess, to fuss with little Arliss about that old yeller dog. Still didn't think much of the idea of keeping him, but I guess that when you're nearly a man, you have to learn to put up with a lot of aggravation from ittle-bitty kids. Remember, aggravation means frustrated or annoyed. Let Arliss keep the thieving rascal. I guess I could provide enough meat for him, too. That's how I was feeling when I crossed Birdsong Creek and rode up the spring under the trees below the house. Then suddenly I felt different. That's when I found little Arliss in the pool again, and there in there with him was the big yeller dog, that dirty, stinking rascal romping around in our drinking water. "Arliss!" I yelled at Arliss. "You get that nasty old dog out of the water!" They hadn't seen me right up, and I guess it was my sudden yell that surprised both of them so bad. Arliss went tearing out the pool on one side and the dog out on the other. Arliss was screaming his head off, and here came the big dog with his wet fur rising along the ridge of his backbone, baying at me like I was a panther. I didn't give him a chance to get me. I was too quick about jumping off the mule and grabbing some rocks. I was lucky. The first rock I threw hit the bug dog right between the eyes, and I was throwing hard. He went down, yelling and pitching and walling. Just as he came to his feet again, I caught him in the ribs with another one. That was too much for him. He turned tail and took out for the house, squalling and bawling. Is Travis acting like a man or a boy here? But I wasn't the only good rock thrower in our family. Arliss was only 5 years old, but I spent a lot of time showing how to throw a rock. Now I wish I hadn't, because about then a rock nearly tore my left ear off. I whirled around just barely in time to duck another that would have caught me square in the left eye. I yelled, "Arliss, you quit that!" But Arliss wasn't listening. He was too scared and too mad. He bent over to pick up a rock big enough to brain me with if he'd been strong enough to throw it. Well, when you're 14 years old, you can't afford to mix in a rock fight with your 5-year-old brother. You can't do it, even when you're in the right. You just can't explain a thing like that to your folks. All they'll do is point out how much bigger you are, how unfair it is to your little brother. All I could do was turn tail like the yellow dog and head for the house, yelling for Mama. And right after me came little Arliss, naked and running as fast as he could, doing his dead level best to get close enough to hit me with the big rock he was packing. I outran him, of course. Then here came Mama, running so fast her long skirts were flying, and calling out, "What on earth, boys?" I hollered, "You better catch that Arliss," as I ran past her, and she did, but little Arliss was so mad that I thought for a second he was going to hit her with the rock before she could get away from him. Is Travis acting like a boy or like a man here? Boy or man? I'm sorry, let me try that again. Man or boy? Man or boy? Well, it wound up about like I figured. Mama switched little Arliss for playing in the drinking water. Then she blessed me out good and proper for being so bossy with him. And the big yellow dog that caused all the trouble got off scot-free. It didn't seem right and fair to me. How could I be the man of the family if nobody paid any attention to what I thought or said? I went and led Jumper up the house. I hung the doe in the live oak tree that grew beside the house and began skinning it, cutting up the meat. I thought of the fine shot I made and knew it was worth bragging about to Ma. But what was the use? She wouldn't pay me any mind, not until I did something she thought I shouldn't have done. Then she'd treat me like I wasn't any older than little Arliss. I sulked and felt sorry for myself all the time I worked with the meat. The more I thought about it, the madder I got at the yellow dog. I hung up the fresh cut of venison in the dog run, right where Old Yeller had stole the hog meat the night before. I did it for a couple reasons. To begin with, that was the handiest and coolest places we had for hanging fresh meat. On top of that, I was looking for a good excuse to get rid of the dog. I figured if he stole more of our meat, Mama would have to see he was too sorry and no account to keep. Old Yeller was too smart for that. He gnawed around on some of the deer bone that Mama threw away, but never once even acted like he could smell the meat we'd hung up. Chapter 4. A couple of days later I had another better reason for wanting to get Old Yeller. That was when the two longhorn range bulls met at the house and pulled off their big fight. We first heard the bulls while we were eating our dinner of cornbread, roasted venison, and watercress gathered from below the spring. One bull came off a high rocky ridge to the south of the cabin. We could hear his angry rumbling as he moved down through the thicket of catclaw and scrub oak. Then he lifted his voice in a wild bassy blare that set echoes clamoring in the draws and canyons for miles around. "That old bull's talking fight," I told Mama and little Arliss. "He's bragging that he's the biggest, toughest, and meanest. He's telling the other bulls that if they've got a lick of sense, they'll take cover when he's around." Almost before I'd finished talking, we heard the second bull. He was over the salt lick somewhere. He was bellowing and was just as loud and braggy as the first ones. He was telling the first bull that his fight talk was all bluff, that he was saying he was the bull of the range, that he was the biggest and meanest and toughest. We sat and ate and listened to him. We could tell by their rumblings and bawlings they were gradually working their way down the brush toward each other, getting madder by the minute. I always liked to see a fight between bulls or bears or wild boars or almost any wild animal. Now I got so excited that I jumped up from the table and went to the door, stood listening. I made up my mind that if the bulls met and started to fight, I was going to see it. They're still playing careless weeds and crabgrass that needed hoeing out of the corn, but I guessed I could let them go long enough to see a bullfight. Is Travis acting like a man or like a boy here? Man or boy? Our cabin stood on a high knoll. Remember, a knoll is a hill. About 100 yards above the spring. Years ago, Papa cleared out all the brush and trees from it, leaving a couple live oaks near the house for shade. That was so he could get a clear shot at any Comanche or Apache coming to scalp us. And while I stood there at the door, the first bull entered the clearing right where Papa had one time shot a Comanche off his horse. He was a leggy, mustard-colored bull with his black freckles speckling his jaw and the underside of his belly. He had one great horn set for hooking, while the other hung down past his jaw like a tallow candle that drooped in the heat. He was what the Mexican calls a chongo, or a droop horn. He trotted out a little piece into the clearing and then stopped to drop his head low. He went to snorting and shaking his horns and pawing the dirt dry with his forefeet. He flung dirt back over his neck and shoulders in great clouds of dust. I couldn't see the other bull yet, but I could tell by the sound of him he was getting close and coming in at a trot. I hollered back to Mama and little Arliss, "They're fixing to fight right here where we can see it." There was a split rail fence around our cabin. I ran out and climbed up and took a seat on the top rail. Mama and little Arliss came and climbed up to sit right beside me. Then from the other side of the clearing came the second bull. He was the red roan I'd seen at the salt licks the day I shot the doe. He wasn't as tall as long-legged as the chongo bull, but every bit as heavy and powerful. And while his horns were shorter and they were both curved for hooking. Like the first bull, he came blaring out the clearing, then stopped and snorted and slinging his wild horns, pawing up clouds of dust. He made it plain he wanted to fight just as bad as the first bull. About that time, from somewhere behind the cabin came Old Yeller. He charged through the rails, bristled up, and roared almost as loud as the bulls. All their bellowing and snorting and dust pawing sounded like a threat to him. He come out to run him away from the house. I hollered at him. "Get back here, you rascal," I shouted. "You're fixing to spoil our show." That stopped him, but he still wasn't satisfied. He kept baying at the bulls till I jumped down and picked up a rock. I didn't have to throw it. All I had to do was draw back like I was going to. That sent him flying back to the yard around the corner of the cabin, yelling like I'd murdered him. That also put little Arliss on the fight. He started screaming at me. He tried to get down where he could pick up a rock, but Mama held him. "Hush now, baby," she said. "Travis isn't going to hurt your dog. You just didn't want him to scare off the bulls." Well, it took some talking, but she finally got a little Arliss's mind off and hit me with the rock. I climbed back on the fence. I told Mama I was betting on Chongo. She said she was betting her money on Roni because he had 2 fighting horns. We sat there and watched the bulls get ready to fight and talked and laughed and had ourselves a good time. We never once thought about being in danger. When we learned different, it was nearly too late. Suddenly Chongo quit pawing the air and flung his tail into the air. "Look out," I shouted. "Here it comes." Sure enough, Chongo charged, pounding hardpan with his feet, roaring his mightiest, and here came Roni to meet him, charging with his head low and his tail high in the air. I let out an excited yell. They met head on with a loud crash of horns and a jar that was so solid it seemed like I could feel it clear up there on the fence. Roni went down. I yelled louder, thinking Chongo was winning. A second later, though, Roni was back on his feet and charging through the cloud of dust with their hooves had turned up. He caught Chongo broadside. He slammed the sharp horns up to the hilt in the shoulder of the mustard-colored bull. He drove against them so fast and so hard that Chongo couldn't wheel away. All he could do was barely keep on his feet by giving ground. Here they came, straight for our rail friends. "Land sakes!" Mama cried suddenly, and leaped down from the fence, dragging little Arliss down after her. But I was too excited about the fight. I didn't see the danger in time. I was still astride the top rail when the struggling bulls came crashing through the fence, splintering the post and rails, and toppling me to the ground, almost under them. I lunged to my feet, wild with scare, and knocked flat on my face in the dirt. I thought sure I was a goner. The roaring of the bulls was right in my ear. The hot reek and scent of their blood was in my nose. The bone-crushing weight of their hooves was stomping all around me and over me, churning up such a fog of dust that I couldn't see anything. Then suddenly Mama had me by the hand and was dragging me out from under, yelling in a scared voice, "Run, Travis, run!" Well, she didn't have to keep hollering at me. I was running as fast as I ever hoped to run, and with her running faster and dragging me along by the hand, we scooted through the open cabin door just about a quick breath before Roni slammed Chongo against it. They hit so hard the whole cabin shook. I saw great big chunks of dried mud chinking fall from between the logs. There for a second I thought Chongo was coming through the door right on top of us, but turned broadside like he was. He was too big to shove through a small opening. Then a second later he got off Roni's horns somehow and wheeled on him. Here they went alongside the cabin wall, roaring and stomping and slamming their heels against the logs. I looked at Mama and little Arliss. Mama's face was white as a bedsheet. For once little Arliss was so scared he couldn't scream. Suddenly I wasn't scared anymore. I was just plain mad. I reached for the braided rawhide whip that hung on the coil and the wooden peg driven between the logs. That scared Mama worse. "Oh, no, Travis, don't go out there." "They're fixing to tear down the house, Mama," I said. "But they might run over you," Mama argued. The bulls crashed over the cabin again. They grunted and strained and roared. The horns and hooves clattered against the logs. I turned and headed for the door. Looked to me like they'd kill us all if they broke through the log wall. Mama came running and grabbed my arm. "Call the dog," she said. "Put the dog after him." That was a good idea. I was half aggravated with myself because I hadn't thought of it. Remember, aggravated is annoyed or frustrated. Here was a chance for the old yeller dog to pay back for all the trouble he made around the place. I stuck my head out the door. The bulls had fought away from the house. Now they were busy tearing down more of the yard fence. I ducked out and around the corner. I ran through the dog run toward the back of the house, calling, "Here, Yeller! Here, Yeller! Get 'em, boys! Sick 'em!" Old Yeller was back there all right, but he didn't come and he didn't sick 'em. He took one look at me running towards him with that bullwhip in my hand and knew I'd come to kill him. He tucked his tail and lit out and running, yelling for the woods. If there'd been any way I could have done it right then is when I would have killed him. There wasn't time to mess with the fool dog. I had to do something about the bulls. They were wrecking the place, and I had to stop it. Papa left me to look after things while he was gone, and I wasn't about to let 2 mad bulls tear up everything we had. I ran up to the bulls and went to work on them with the whip. It was a heavy 16-footer, and I practiced with it a lot. I could crack that rawhide popper louder than gunshot. I could cut a branch as thick as my finger off a green mesquite with it. But I couldn't stop those bulls from fighting. They were already too mad. They were hurting too much already. I might as well have been spitting on 'em. I yelled and whipped 'em till I gave clear out. Still, they went right on with their roaring bloody battle. I guess they would have kept on fighting till they leveled the house to the ground if it hadn't been for a freak accident. We had a heavy two-wheeled Mexican cart that Papa used for hauling wood and hay. It happened to be standing out in front of the house, right where the ground broke away in a sharp slant toward the spring and creek. It just had come to me that I could get my gun and shoot the bulls when Chongo crowded Roni up against the cart. He ran that long single horn under Roni's belly. He gave such a big heave that he lifted Roni's feet clear off the ground and rolled him in the air. A second later, Roni landed on his back inside the bed of the dump cart with all 4 feet sticking up. I thought his weight would break the cart to pieces, but I was wrong. The cart was stronger than I thought. All the bull's weight did was tilt it so the wheels started rolling, and away the cart went down the hill, carrying Roni with it. When that happened, Chongo was suddenly the silliest looking bull you ever saw. He stood with his tail up and his head high, staring after the runaway cart. He couldn't for the life of him figure out what he'd done to the roan bull. The rolling cart rattled and banged and careened its way down the slope until it was right beside the spring. Remember, careen means uncontrolled. There one wheel struck a big boulder, bouncing that side of the cart so high that it turned over and skidded to a stop. The roan bull spilled out right into the spring. Water flew in all directions. Roni got his feet under him. He scrambled up out of the hole, but I guess that cart ride had sudden wind had taken all the fight out of him. Anyhow, he headed for the timber, running with his tail tucked, water streaming down out of his hair, leaving a dark wet trail in the dry dust to show which way he'd gone. Chongo saw Roni then. He snorted and went after him, but then he got to the cart. He slid to a sudden stop. The cart, lying there on its side now, still had that top wheel spinning around and around. Chongo never seen anything like that. He stood staring at the spinning wheel. He couldn't understand it. He lifted his nose close to smell it. Finally he reached out his long tongue to lick it and taste it. That was a bad mistake. I guess the iron tire on the spinning wheel had roughed up pretty bad. Maybe he had chips of broken rock and gravel stuck in it. Anyhow, from the way Chongo acted, it must have scraped all the hide off his tongue. Chongo bawled and went running backward. He whirled so fast he lost his footing and fell down. He came to his feet and took out in the opposite direction from the roan bull. He ran, slinging his head and flopping his long tongue around, bawling like he'd stuck in a bear trap. He ran with his tail clamped just as tight as the roan bull's. It was enough to make you laugh your head off the way both those bulls had gotten the wits scared clear out of him, each one thinking he lost the fight. But they sure did make a wreck of the yard fence. So, it hints in the beginning of the story that Travis ends up falling in love with the dog. What do you think the dog does that makes Travis love him so much? All right. So now that we've read a little bit of the story, I want you guys to give me examples of a time when Travis acted like a man, a time when he acted like a child, and a time when he acted a little bit like both. So, a time that I could think of that he acted like a man was when Travis did the work without his mama asking him to. I think that made him act like a man. So, I think a time that he acted like a child was when Arliss was chasing him with the big rock. Now, it's kind of hard to think of a time when he acted like both, but a time that comes to my mind is when Travis brought after Arliss for being in the water hole. because he was right to get Arliss out of the water hole, but the way he went about it was not right. He was just kind of bullying his brother. Even though that's how his dad does it, you can't really do that with a younger brother. So what I want you to do is kind of like I did here, is give examples of a time when Travis was a man, acted like a man, a time when he acted like a child, and a time when he acted like both. And give me sound reason. Give me your reasoning why you feel like like he acted like a man, or why you feel like he acted like a child. So, like when I explained, I felt like he acted like both when he got after Arliss for being in the water hole, because he acted like a man getting him out of the water hole, which was something that needed to be done. But in the way he went about it, it was not manlike. When you finish, don't forget to put your name on the worksheet. And when you finish, bring it up to me and we'll go on to the next task.